Chapter 6 of Inspector French's Greatest Case by Freeman Wills Crofts. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganand. Inspector French's Greatest Case, Chapter 6, The Hotel in Barcelona. To a comparative stay-at-home like Inspector French, who considered a run to Plymouth or Newcastle a long journey, the trailing of Jean Vanderkemp across southwest France opened up a conception of the size of the globe whereon he moved, and had his being which left him slightly awestruck. The journey from Savoy to Spain seemed endless, the distances incredible, the expanse of country between himself and home illimitable. Hour after hour he sat in the train, while elms and oaks gave place to cypresses and olives, apples to vines, and corn to maize, and it was not until daylight had gone on the evening of the second day that the train rolled into the Station de Francia in Barcelona. The porter at the Beau Séjour at Chamonix had written down the names of 2 or 3 hotels at which he thought English would be spoken, and passing out of the station, French showed the paper to a taxi driver. The man at first ogled it distrustfully, then with a smile of comprehension he emitted a rapid flood of some unknown language, opened the taxi door, bowed his fare in, and rapidly cranking his engine, set off into the night. French was conscious of being well down a great avenue, wider than any he had yet seen, brilliantly lighted, and with rows of palms down the center. They turned through a vast square with what looked like a commemorative column in the middle, then up a slightly narrower tree-lined boulevard, where presently the vehicle swung into the curb, and French found himself at his destination, the Hotel d'Orient. To his extreme relief, the head porter spoke English. He got him to settle with the taxi man, and soon he began to forget the fatigues of the journey with the help of a luxurious bath and dinner. He decided that he had done enough for one day, and presently, soothed by a cigar, he went out into the great street in front of the hotel, and its rows of trees and brilliant arc lamps. He did not know then that this gently sloping boulevard was one of the famous streets of the world, Rambla, known as is Piccadilly in London, the Champs-Élysées in Paris, or Fifth Avenue in New York. For an hour he roamed, then tired out, he returned to the Orient, and a few minutes later was sunk in dreamless slumber. Early next morning he was seated with the manager, who also spoke English. But neither the manager nor any of his staff could help him, and French recognized that so far as the Orient was concerned, he had drawn blank. He therefore set to work on the other hotels, taking the largest first, the Colonne, in the Plaza da Cotilona, and Quatre Nations, and such like. Then he went to the smaller establishments, and at the 4th he paused suddenly, thrilled by an unexpected sight. The hotel was in the side street of the Paseo de Colón, the great boulevard through which he had been driven on the previous evening. The entrance door led into a kind of lounge in which were seated half a dozen people, evidently waiting for déjeuner. With one exception, these were obviously Spaniards, but that exception, French felt he could swear, was the original of the photograph. In spite of such a meeting being what he was hoping for, the inspector was taken aback. But his hesitation was momentary. Passing immediately on to the little office at the back of the lounge, he said in English, "Can I have lunch, please? Will it be ready?" A dark-eyed, dark-haired girl came forward, smiling but shaking her head regretfully, and murmuring what was evidently that she couldn't understand. "You don't speak English, miss?" the detective went on, speaking loudly and very clearly. "I want to know, can I have lunch, and if it will soon be ready?" As the girl still shook her head, French turned back into the lounge. "Excuse me," he addressed the company gently, "but might I ask if any of you gentlemen speak English? I can't make this young lady understand." The little ruse succeeded. The man resembling Vanderkemp rose. "I speak English," he answered. "What is it you want?" "Lunch," French returned, "and to know if it will soon be ready." "I can answer that for you," the other declared, after he had explained the situation to the girl. "Lunch will be ready in exactly 5 minutes, and visitors are usually welcome." "Thank you," French spoke in leisurely, conversational way. "I am staying at the Orient, where 1 or 2 of them speak English, but business brought me to this part of the town, and I did not want to go all the way back to lunch. A confounded nuisance, this language business. It makes you feel pretty helpless when you want to talk to people. That's true, the stranger admitted. In most of the larger hotels, they speak French and English, but at practically none of the smaller. In this one, for example, one waiter has a few words of French only. No English or Italian or German. Some of the staff don't even speak Spanish. French was interested in spite of the larger question which was occupying his mind. Not Spanish? He repeated. How do you mean? What do they speak? Catalan. This is Catalonia, you know, and both the race and the language are different from the rest of Spain. They are more go-ahead and enterprising than the people farther south. That sounds a bit like Ireland, French remarked. I've been both in Belfast and in the south, and the same things seem to hold good, though Dublin is a fine city and no mistake. They continued discussing peoples and languages and the northerly concentration of energy to be found in most countries until the hands of the clock pointed to noon and lunchtime. Then French caught what he had been angling for. The stranger asked him to share his table. The inspector continued to make himself agreeable, and after they had finished, invited the other to have coffee and a cigar with him in a deserted corner of the lounge. Then, thinking his companion was by this time off his guard, he introduced a new subject after a lull in the conversation. It is strange the different businesses people are engaged on, he remarked ruminatively as he poured himself out a second cup of coffee. Now, I wouldn't mind betting a £10 note you wouldn't guess what I am and what my business here is. The other laughed. I confess I was wondering, he admitted. I'm afraid I should lose my money. I won't guess. Well, I'll tell you, though our business is not a thing we speak of as a rule. I'm a detective inspector from Scotland Yard. As he spoke, French watched the other's face. If this were the man of whom he was in search, he could swear he would make him exhibit some emotion. But so far he did not succeed. His new acquaintance merely laughed again. Then I should have lost. I admit I never thought of that. French continued to observe, and he went on with more seriousness in his manner. Yes, and I'm on rather important business too. Man wanted for murder and robbery in the city. A bad affair enough. He murdered the confidential clerk of a diamond merchant in Hatton Garden and rifled the safe and got off with I don't know how many £1,000s worth of stuff. At the commencement of French's reply, the stranger had listened, but with little more than a conventional interest, but at the mention of a diamond merchant in Hatton Garden, he figuratively sat up and began to take notice. Hatton Garden? He repeated. That's an extraordinary coincidence. Why, I belong to a firm of diamond merchants in Hatton Garden. I know them all. Who was the man? Inspector French was puzzled. Either Vanderkamp, for there could no longer be any doubt of his identity, was innocent, or he was almost incredibly good actor. Anxious to observe the man further, he fenced a little in his reply. Is it possible you haven't heard? He asked in apparent surprise. How long is it since you have heard from home? I haven't had a line of any kind since I left, and that's nearly 3 weeks ago, on the night of the 25th of the last month to be exact. The 25th? Well, that's a coincidence too. That's the very night poor old Mr. Gething was killed. Vanderkamp stiffened suddenly, and his hands closed on the arms of his chair. What? He cried. Not Charles Gething of Messrs. Duke and Peabody? French, now keenly observing him without any attempt at concealment, nodded. That's the man. You knew him then? Of course I knew him. Why, it's my own firm. Good God, to think of poor old Gething. And you say the safe was rifled? You don't tell me Mr. Duke's collection of stones is gone? All of it, and money as well. The murderer made a clean sweep. Vanderkamp whistled and then swore. Tell me about it. French was more than ever puzzled. The traveller's manner, his evident emotion, his questions, all seemed those of an innocent man. He felt doubts arise in his mind. Possibly there might be an explanation. He did not at once reply, as he turned over in his mind how he could best surprise the other into an admission of the truth. But Vanderkamp also was evidently thinking, and suddenly an expression of deeper concern showed on his face. He made as if to speak, then hesitated, and a wary look appeared in his eyes. He cleared his throat, then, in a changed voice, asked, At what time did it happen? French leaned forward swiftly and fixed his eyes on his companion as he said in a low, tense tone, That's what I want to ask you, Mr. Vanderkamp. The man started. He did not answer, and the wary look in his eyes changed into definite anxiety, which deepened as the moments passed. At last he spoke. "It had just dawned on me from what you said, Inspector, that our meeting here was not such a coincidence as I had first imagined. I see that you suspect me of the crime. What has happened, I don't know. What you have against me, I don't know either. But I can tell at once that I am not only absolutely innocent, but until you told me just now, I was ignorant that a crime had been committed. I will tell you my whole story and answer any questions you may like to ask, whether you believe me or not." French nodded. Certainly, if guilty, this man was a consummate actor. There was at least a chance that he might be innocent, and he answered accordingly. "I don't accuse you of anything, Mr. Vanderkemp, but there are certain suspicious circumstances which require an explanation. You may be able to account for all of them. I hope you will. At the same time, it is fair to warn you that, failing an explanation, your arrest is not impossible, and in that case, anything that you may say now may be used against you in evidence." Vanderkemp was by this time extremely ill at ease. His face had paled and had already taken on somewhat drawn and haggard expression. For a while he remained silent, buried in thought. Then, with a sudden gesture of throwing further caution to the winds, he began to speak. "I'll tell you what I know, Inspector," he said earnestly. "Whether, if you are going to arrest me, I am wise or foolish, I don't know. But I can at least assure you that it is the literal truth." He looked at the inspector, who nodded approval. "Of course, I can't advise you, Mr. Vanderkemp," he remarked, "but all the same, I believe you are doing the wise thing." "I am in a difficulty," Vanderkemp went on, "as I don't know how much of the circumstances you are familiar with. It would therefore be better if you would ask me questions." "I should do so, but first I should like your own statement. I am aware of your name and position in the firm. Also that Mr. Crofts received a letter on the 21st of last month asking him to send you to London to undertake an important commission in Sweden. Also that you left your lodgings in Kinkestad at 8:30 on the evening of 24th. I have since learned certain other facts as to your subsequent movements, which I need not mention at the moment. What I want you now to do is to let me have a detailed account of your experiences from the moment of your leaving your lodgings until the present time." "I will do so," Vanderkemp spoke eagerly, as if now anxious to get through with the matter. "But there is one thing which comes earlier in point of time which I must mention. You have probably heard of it from Mr. Duke, and I shall tell you anyway. I mean about my further instructions as to my London visit, the private instructions. You have seen a copy of them?" French, always cautious, was not giving away information. He wondered to what the other was referring, but merely said, "Assume I have not, Mr. Vanderkemp. It is obvious that I must check your statement with the information in my possession." "Well then, though you probably know it already, I may tell you I received additional instructions about my visit. Mr. Duke wrote me a private letter addressed to my lodgings, in which he told— But I have it here, and you can see it for yourself." He took an envelope from his pocket-book and passed it across. It contained a note almost identical in appearance with the forged one which Mr. Crofts had received. It was typewritten on a sheet of the firm's cheaper memorandum paper, with the same kind of type and the same colored ribbon. Examination with the lens showed the same defects in the N and the G. The signature was obviously forged, and the back of the sheet was marked from a heavy touch. Evidently, both letters had been written by the same person and on the Hatton Garden machine. The note read, "Dear Vanderkemp, further to my note to Mr. Crofts regarding your call on Wednesday morning 26th instance, the business on which I wish to see you has turned out to be more urgent than I at first believed, and I shall therefore have to ask you to advance the hour of your interview and also to leave London for Paris, not Stockholm, immediately after it. I shall return to the office after dinner on Tuesday evening, 25th instance, and shall be glad if you will call there at 8:30 p.m. when I shall give you your instructions. This will enable you to catch the 9:30 p.m. for Paris via Southampton and Havre. I wish to impress to you that as the business in question is exceptionally confidential, you will oblige me by keeping your change of plans to yourself. Yours truly, R.A. Duke." Inspector French was keenly interested, but he recognized with exasperation how inconclusive the letter was as evidence. Either it had been sent to Vanderkemp as he stated, in which case he might be innocent, or the man had written it himself, in which case he certainly was guilty. It was true that in this instance an envelope was forthcoming which bore a London easy postmark and the correct date, but here again there was no proof that this was really the covering in which the letter had come. These points passed through the inspector's mind, but he banished them as matters to be thought out later and turned once more to his companion. "I shall keep this, if you don't mind," he declared. "Please proceed." I carried out the instructions in the letter, Vanderkamp resumed. The change of hours necessitated my leaving Amsterdam by the night train on the 24th, and I spent the following day at my hotel in London and in doing a matinee. At 8:30, with my luggage, I reached Hatton Garden. I found the outer office was in darkness, but a light shone out of the doorway of the inner office. Mr. Getting was there alone. He told me to come in and shut the door, and I did so and sat down in the client's armchair. Mr. Getting was seated at Mr. Duke's desk, which was open. Was the safe open? No, nor was it opened while I was there. Mr. Getting told me that Mr. Duke had intended to be present to give me my instructions in person, but at the last moment he had been prevented coming down, and that he had asked him, Mr. Getting, to do it instead. It seemed that Mr. Duke had got information from a confidential agent at Constantinople that a member of the old Russian aristocracy had escaped with his family jewels from the clutches of the Bolsheviks, and that he now wished to dispose of the whole collection for what it would bring. He was at one time Duke Sergius of one of the Ural provinces. I have the name in my book upstairs, but was now passing himself off as a Pole under the name of Francisco Lotz. The collection was one of extraordinary excellence, and Mr. Duke believed it could be purchased for a third or even less of its retail value. He had approached the Duke through the agent and had offered to deal. The trouble, however, was that the Soviet government had learnt of the Duke's escape and were displaying immense energy in the hope of recapturing him. Their agents were scouring the whole of Europe, and Loth was in mortal terror, for discovering meant certain death. Mr. Getting told me straight that should I succeed in purchasing, my life would not be worth a tinker's curse until I had handed over the stuff. He said that, recognizing this, Mr. Duke considered that my commission should be substantially increased, and he asked me was I willing to take on the job. "And you agreed?" "Well, what do you think? Of course I agreed. I asked for further details, and he let me have them. For both my own safety and Lot's, I was to take extraordinary precautions. My name is pretty well known in dealer circles over Europe, and therefore would be known to the Soviet emissaries, so I was to take another. I was to become John Harrison of Huddersfield, a tin plate manufacturer. I was not to write to the office direct, but to send my reports, if any were necessary, to Mr. Herbert Lyons, a friend of Mr. Duke's, who lived not far from him at Hampstead. If I had to write, I was to be most careful to phrase my letter so that, were I suspected and my correspondence tampered with, it would not give away the affair. Instructions to me would be sent to Harrison and written on plain note paper, and would be worded in a similar careful way. Mr. Getting gave me a code by which I could wire the amount agreed on, when the money would be sent me by special messenger, that is, if we could come to terms. Vanderkamp paused and glanced at the inspector, but the latter not speaking, he continued. Loth was hidden in Constantinople, but was trying to come west. He was not sure whether he could do so best by land or sea. If he could get out of Turkey by land, he would work his way up the Danube to Austria and Switzerland, and would stop eventually at the Beau Séjour Hotel in Chamonix. If that proved impossible, he would try to leave by sea, and would travel by one of the Navigazione Generale Italiana boats to Genoa, and thence to Barcelona, where he would put up at the Gomez Hotel, that is, this one. He had let Mr. Duke know through his Constantinople friend that if he didn't turn up at Chamonix by the 4th, it would mean either that the Bolsheviks had caught him, or that he was making for Barcelona. My instructions, therefore, were to go to Chamonix, put up at the Beau Séjour, and look out until the 4th for a tall, white-complexioned, dark-haired man named Francisco Loth. If by that time he had not turned up, I was to move on here. I was to wait here for a fortnight, at the end of which time, if I had still heard nothing of him, I was to go on to Constantinople, look up Mr. Duke's agent, and try for news of Loth's fate. And you carried out the instructions? Yes. I went to Chamonix and stayed there for a week. Seeing no one could have possibly be the man, I came on here and have been waiting here ever since. Tomorrow I proposed to leave for Constantinople. French threw away the butt of his cigar and selected another. Such a trip could not be accomplished without money, he said slowly. How were you equipped in that way? Mr. Getting handed me £100 and £10 notes. I changed 2 in Chamonix, and I have the remaining 8 in my pocket. "You might let me see them." Vanderkemp readily complied, and the inspector found, as he expected, that the 8 notes were among those stolen from the safe. He resumed his interrogation. "You say you reached the office in Hatton Garden about 8:30?" "Yes, and left about 9. My business occupied only half an hour." "And you saw no one except Mr. Gething?" "No one." French, having offered his possible future prisoner another cigar, sat silent, thinking deeply. He had no doubt that the story of the escaped Russian was a fabrication from beginning to end. Besides being an unlikely tale in itself, it broke down on the point of its authorship. Vanderkemp's statement was that Gething had been told the story by Mr. Duke, and that Mr. Duke would have been present to tell it to him, Vanderkemp, in person, were he not prevented by some unexpected cause. This also was an obvious fabrication, but the reason of its insertion into the tale was clear enough. Without it, the story would have no authority. The use of Mr. Duke's name was an essential part of any such scheme, just as the forging of Mr. Duke's signature had been necessary for the letters of instruction to Schooves and Vanderkemp. But though French felt sure enough of his ground so far, on trying to take a further step he was held up by the same difficulty with which he had been faced in considering the forged letters. Was Gething guilty, and had he invented this elaborate plan to throw suspicion onto Vanderkemp, or was Vanderkemp the criminal and the story his scheme for accounting for his actions since the murder? That was a real difficulty, and French sat wondering if there was no test he could apply, no way in which he could reach certainty, no trap which the victim would be unable to avoid. For some time he could think of none, but presently an idea occurred to him which he thought might be worthwhile following up. Some information might be gained through the typewriting of the 2 forged letters. Could Vanderkemp type, and if so, was his work done with a light or heavy touch? He turned to his companion. "I wish you would write me a short statement of your movements in London on the night of the crime, stating the times at which you arrived at and left the various places you visited. I should prefer it typed. That is, if you can type. Can you?" Vanderkemp smiled wanly. "I think so," he answered. "I type and write shorthand in 4 languages, but I have no machine here." "Borrow one from the office," French suggested, as he expressed his admiration of the other's prowess. It took a personal visit to the office, but Vanderkemp, anxious to defer to the inspector's whims, managed to overcome the scruples of the languorous, dark-eyed beauty who reigned therein, and returned triumphant with the machine. 10 minutes later, French had his timetable. Instantly he saw that Vanderkemp typed as an expert, with a light, sure touch that produced a perfect impression, but did not dint the paper. It was a point in the man's favor. By no means conclusive, it was still by no means negligible. Inspector French was puzzled. His experience told him that in this world the ordinary, natural, and obvious thing happened. A man who secretly visited the scene of a crime at about the hour at which the crime was known to be committed, and who then left the country on a mysterious and improbable mission, the reality of which was denied by its alleged author. A man, further, who had in his pocket banknotes stolen from the scene of the crime. Such a man in the ordinary, prosaic, everyday life was a criminal. Such, French thought, was common sense, and common sense, he considered, was right 99 times out of 100. But there was always the 100th chance. Improbabilities and coincidences did occasionally happen. He would have given a good deal at that moment to know if this case was the exception that proves the rule. He saw clearly that his second explanation, if somewhat more far-fetched, was still quite possibly true. It certainly might be that Vanderkemp had been duped, that he had been sent on this wild-goose chase by the murderer with the object of drawing on himself just that suspicion which he had attracted, and thus allowing the real scent to cool. A good many of the facts tended in that direction. The forged letters, the keeping of the alleged deal from Schooves, the fact that no Russian nobleman had turned up at either of the rendezvous named, the travelling under a false name, the warning against communications with the office, and last but not least, Vanderkemp's manner during the interview, all these undoubtedly supported the view that the traveller had been used to lay a gigantic false clue. If so, it was a fiendish trap to set for the unfortunate dupe. French thought he could see how it had intended to pan out. Vanderkemp, while on these mysterious journeys, certainly when he reached Mr. Duke's agent in Constantinople, would learn of the murder, and he would at once see how he had been victimized. And the more he learned of the details, the more he would realize how completely he was in the toils. He would recognize that if he went home and told his story, he would not have a dark chance of clearing himself, and he would turn his apparent flight into a real one and so permanently fasten upon himself a tacit admission of guilt. It was an ingenious scheme, and if it really were the explanation of these mysterious happenings, it gave an indication of the character and mentality of the man who had devised it. French was by no means decided as to the truth of the matter, but on the whole he thought that though he undoubtedly had evidence to justify him in applying for the arrest and extradition of the traveller, he would prefer to avoid this step if possible. If the man tried to give him the slip, the local police would get him in no time. Accordingly, he turned once more to Vanderkemp. "Mr. Vanderkemp," he began, "I am strongly inclined to believe your story, but as a man of the world you will readily see that it must be more completely examined before it can be fully accepted. Now the question is, are you willing to come back with me to London and give me your assistance towards finding out the truth? I can make you no promise that you will not be arrested on reaching British grounds, but I can promise you that you will be fairly dealt with and get every chance and assistance to prove your innocence." Vanderkemp did not hesitate in his reply. "I will go," he said promptly. "I am aware that you can have me arrested here if you want to by applying to the Spanish authorities, so I have no choice. But I think I should go in any case. I have done nothing contrary to the law, and I have done nothing to be ashamed of. I cannot now rest until my innocence is admitted." French nodded gravely. "Once again, sir, I think you are doing the wise thing. Let us go tonight by the Paris express. In the meantime, come with me to the post office and help me to send a wire to the Yard." 2 mornings later they reached London. Mr. Duke was naturally amazed at his subordinate's story, and on hearing the evidence, gave it his opinion that Vanderkemp was a dupe of some person or persons unknown. What was more to the point, Chief Inspector Mitchell, French's immediate superior, took the same view, and Vanderkemp therefore was not arrested, though he was shadowed night and day. French undertook to investigate into his life and circumstances, which showed that these had been painted in somewhat darker colors than appeared justifiable, but which revealed no evidence about the crime. Furthermore, none of the jewels could be traced to him, nor any of the stolen notes other than those he had spoken of. Once more the days began to slip past without bringing to light any fresh fact, and as time passed, French grew more worried and despondent, and his superior officers more querulous. And then something occurred to turn his attention to a completely different side of the case and send him off with fresh hope and energy on a new clue. The end of Chapter 6.